Welcome. If you clicked on this video, it's because you want to learn more about your periods. Maybe you're like me and you went to your OBGYN with issues and they asked you, do you have heavy periods? And you always just kind of said no, but you kind of would ask yourself like, well, how do I know though, like objectively? That is something that we're going to be covering in this video. So in this video, we're going to talk about what exactly our period can tell us, how to objectively track our bleeding to know if we're having a heavy period or a light period or a healthy normal period. And we're going to learn how to chart those observations, either using an app or using a free paper chart that I provide you. So the first really important thing for you to know is that your period does give you vital information. I know it's hard to see it in a good way, especially if, like me, you kind of are miserable when you're on your period. Honestly, it has helped me to not dread it so much because I know that I'm going to get information from it. So I hope that this does the same for you. Essentially, our uterine lining is being built up during our cycle. Starting, after our period has ended, our uterine lining is being built up again. Estrogen, by the way, is the main hormone that acts to build up our uterine lining. And then if pregnancy does not take place, that uterine lining then sheds, and that is our period. So it's showing us our hormonal health from the previous cycle. Why do I say that? Well, let's say you had high estrogen. So estrogen is proliferative, and it was building and building and building up your uterine lining more than necessary, more than a healthy uterine lining should be. So because of that, you might be having a heavier period than normal. And on the flip side, if maybe you're experiencing light periods, maybe your uterine lining isn't being built up, maybe you actually have lower estrogen. There are a host of different things that can affect our periods. We can't just assume, oh, I have heavy periods, it's just high estrogen, I guess, because there are so many things that could cause a heavier period. Endometriosis is one of them. Fibroids. Just know that there are many things, and your healthcare provider should definitely be taking this seriously. So essentially, our periods can tell us our hormonal health, and they could clue us in to potential hormonal imbalances or other underlying issues. We're going to move on to tracking our periods, tracking our bleeding specifically. So I'm going to give you some objective measurements, and there's a couple ways that we could go about this. And it mainly depends on what products you use. So if you use mainly pads, I'm going to give you some helpful visuals so that you're able to kind of put a number to what you're seeing. If you use tampons or a menstrual cup, it's actually a lot easier to translate that to milliliters, which is the measurement that I like to look at. The reason why knowing how many milliliters we're bleeding is helpful is because the normal range for a healthy, not just normal range, but the healthy range for a healthy blood loss during your entire period is 40 to 80 milliliters. So that means that if you're losing less than 40 milliliters of blood throughout your entire period, you would have a light period. If you are losing more than 80 milliliters of blood in the whole period, then you are experiencing a heavy period. Now, another thing to note is oftentimes with a heavy period, you may be experiencing a lot of clots. So clots bigger, like an inch or bigger, or quarter sized or larger, are a sign of heavy periods, as well as bleeding for 7 or more days and bleeding through products in 1 to 2 hours for multiple hours. So if you're having to change your pad or tampon like every hour or two, like all day, even if it's just like one day during your cycle, like you're losing a lot of blood that day. And we're gonna get into exactly how much blood you're losing. Now let's move into tracking our bleeding. So the main way that we're going to be doing this is we're going to be keeping track of how many products we're using. So what exactly this will look like will depend on the products that you use. You can know how many milliliters the cup holds typically like 25 milliliters. And then you can just go based off of that. Like if you fill 1 full cup on day 1 of your period and you know that your cup holds 25 milliliters, then you know that you bled 25 milliliters that day. And it's the most straightforward way to keep track. I'm a huge advocate for menstrual cups, especially if you're really wanting to track how much you're bleeding. It's just the easiest way. You want to get used to what it's going to look like. For instance, what does 5 milliliters of blood look like versus 10 milliliters or maybe 15 milliliters? First, this is a pad with 5 milliliters of blood. This is what that looks like. Not very much. Now, this is what 10 milliliters of blood looks like. That tends to be where most of us are going to change our pad, but it's also helpful to kind of know what more looks like. So this is what 15 milliliters would look like. So that also might be kind of a pretty normal point for you to be switching your pad out. And then finally, this is what 30 milliliters of blood looks like. This is soaked through. This would hopefully not be the point that you have to be changing it if you're bleeding that much. You definitely have a heavy period. But every once in a while, this may happen. And so it's helpful for you to know, like, okay, eyeballing that based off of what I know, that looks like about 30 milliliters. So essentially how I would encourage you to use this information is, all right, based off of these pictures, it looks like that 10 milliliter point is where I typically will change my pad, if pads are your go-to products. Then you don't have to necessarily be writing milliliters. You can just write, I used 3 pads. And because you know that you change it at that 10 milliliter mark, you know that that means 30 milliliters of blood. So we're gonna move on to tampons, and I'm going to put on the screen a couple of the different absorbencies and how many milliliters of blood they hold. This is just a helpful tool, but once again, if you know the tampons that you typically use and the point that you typically change them out, you don't necessarily need to be writing how many milliliters you bled that day. You just have to write how many products you use. If you're using a menstrual cup, either look at the packaging, because the packaging will probably say, or if you just look up the cup that you bought, it will probably say how many milliliters it holds. If it doesn't, just when it's clean and sterilized, just fill it to the top with water and then pour it out into, if you have like a measuring cup or something, and that way you can see, you know, how much it holds. And it can be helpful for any of your products. It can be helpful if you specify, okay, like 2 pads, comma, 1 pad, 5 milliliters. But because you know how you do things, you know those other pads were changed at 10 milliliters, if that makes sense. It doesn't have to be super complicated. I'm kind of giving you extra information so you can make it as complicated as you want. You can make it as detailed as you want. So now, knowing all of this, if you kind of translate products used to milliliters and you look at that for the total period, you add it all up, it should fall within 40 to 80 milliliters. This is something that I use to keep track of my cycles, kind of a recap of the entire period. So you can see how many milliliters of blood I lost in total. And I like to keep track of my worst cramps, total days of cramps, headaches, pelvic pain, luteal length, period length, just different things that are important and symptoms that I struggle with. For charting with an app, if you don't want to use the paper chart, although I encourage using both if possible, app suggestions, I would recommend using FEMM, F-E-M-M, it's a completely free app, or Kindara, K-I-N-D-A-R-A, also a free app, or Read Your Body, which is not a free app, but it's not too expensive, and that one is fully customizable, so I've definitely heard a lot of good things. I personally just haven't used it. Well, that's not true. I used it for like that free trial period, and I liked it, but not enough to pay for it. So I'm kind of gonna give you instructions based off of the FEMM app, because I definitely encourage that you use that. FEM is actually where I am doing my certification training through, and I really, really like what they stand for and the medical management that they incorporate. So when it comes to tracking your bleeding on here, when you open the app and you go to like enter your information for the day, you will see these buttons. It would be like 5 buttons, I believe, for your flow. So there's spotting, light, moderate, heavy, and then brown bleeding. And then if you look to the right of bleeding, there will be this little eye icon, and that gives you information. It's a little bit of a cheat sheet if you forget the information from this video and you just need a refresher as far as like, okay, is this considered a light day or a moderate day? It has the little cheat sheet. Light day would be like 1 to 2 pads, moderate day would be 3 to 4 pads, and a heavy day would be like 5+ pads or tampons. And you know, earlier in this video we talked more about it. Just keep in mind that that cheat sheet is based off of each product holding 5 milliliters of blood, and there's a lot of times that that might not necessarily be the case if you're using a like super tampon, if you're not changing your pad when it's just at that 5 milliliter mark. So just kind of keep that in mind, but it is a helpful little tool there. So once you've selected your flow, you can write in the notes section how many products you used, you know, what we talked about earlier with tracking. You can write all that stuff in the notes section just like you would in the paper chart. There is a section for notes. It is limiting. It doesn't let you just, you know, write like thousands and thousands of words, but I find that it's plenty. If you need to abbreviate things, you can. But that is pretty much that. And if you use the app, you will notice that there's all kinds of stuff for tracking cervical fluid. And again, it does give you a little bit of information just through the app. Thank you so much for watching this video.